Nothing in Damian Falcone's world was ever allowed to exist by chance. And yet now, a maid had brazenly stepped into his territory, carrying with her a multitude of things he couldn't explain. He had once been confident that he controlled every secret within his family, until tonight. Watching his powerful mother smile gently as she protected the sleep of a girl who was a complete stranger, Damian bitterly realized two things. First, his mother was hiding a devastating secret. Second, his cold fortress had just been invaded by an unfamiliar warmth. But what he could never have anticipated was that Mia's appearance wasn't a coincidence. It was fate being pulled back into his life by a promise that had been buried in the past. Before the story begins, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to support us, and we wish you a wonderful time with this story. That night, Damian had long been accustomed to sleeping with part of his ear always listening, so even the faintest sound was enough to draw him toward his mother's room, and afterward, he could never explain why he had stopped outside the door for longer than usual instead of merely glancing inside and moving on. It was the scent that reached him first, even before his eyes could find the room, a vague, warm fragrance drifting into the hallway, lavender mingled with something sweeter underneath, perhaps chamomile, something no employee in the house had ever thought to bring into a sick room where the temperature was kept precisely as the doctors had prescribed. He quietly looked inside. The bedside lamp cast a soft amber glow across the room where his mother lay propped against her pillows, much thinner than she had been a year ago, her breathing slow and steady in sleep. But it was the young woman sitting beside her who truly made him stop. Mia Doyle must have been reading to her as she usually did, and somewhere in the middle of an unfinished sentence, exhaustion had carried her away, leaving her slumped completely forward in the chair, her cheek resting against her folded arm, her other hand still lying lightly on the open page, as though she still intended to finish reading the moment she woke. Never in his life had he seen his mother allow anyone to come this close to her, let alone a young woman who had been in the house for less than 2 months. Then he saw his mother stir faintly. Her eyes opened halfway, found the girl sleeping beside her, and lingered there for a long moment, in the way people look at something they have already decided not to disturb. Then, instead of waking her, she smiled softly, closed her eyes again, and simply let the girl sleep where she was. Damian stood frozen in the darkness, his hand still raised toward the door he had never touched, and two things struck him at once, without warning and without mercy, a warmth so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees, because it had been so long since he had seen his mother this peaceful, and then, cold and immediate, a question he couldn't silence, because a woman like Isabella Falcone didn't lower her defenses for anyone so quickly, not even for her own son. What he did not know yet, what he could not have known standing in that doorway, was that the answer had nothing to do with the present at all, that somewhere in his mother's past was a promise made to a man neither of them had ever spoken his name aloud in this house, a man who, it would turn out, was the father of the very girl sleeping in that chair. He did not push the door open. He did not make a sound. Damian eased backward down the carpeted hallway one careful step at a time, the way he had learned as a boy to move through rooms where a single misplaced footfall could end a negotiation before it began, and only once he had rounded the corner and put 2 closed doors between himself and that amber light did he let out the breath he had been holding. He walked the rest of the way to his study without seeing any of it. The family portraits, the long windows facing the dark water, the security monitor blinking quietly in its alcove, because his mind was still standing in that doorway, still watching his mother choose a stranger's comfort over her own dignity of routine. He sat down behind his desk and did not turn on the overhead light, only the small lamp at the corner, and for a long while he simply sat there with his hands flat on the wood, trying to name the thing that had happened to him in that hallway, and failing. He told himself it was concern. He told himself that any man in his position, a man who had built his entire life on knowing exactly who stood inside his walls and exactly what they wanted, would have done precisely what he was about to do, and that the warmth he had felt watching his mother sleep peacefully for the first time in a year had nothing to do with the cold, careful calculation now moving through him like the opening steps of a negotiation. He opened his laptop. The household management system took his credentials without hesitation, the way it always did, and he found the personnel file in 4 keystrokes, a folder he had never once had reason to open in 6 years of employing a staff of 30 people, because staff was Mrs. Whitfield's concern, not his, until tonight. Mia Doyle, 26 years old, hired 8 weeks earlier through a referral he did not recognize. No next of kin listed beyond a mother in Hartford, Connecticut, no criminal record, no debts registered under her name, a scattering of previous employment that told him nothing except that she had worked hard and been paid little for it. He read it twice, and it told him almost nothing, which unsettled him more than if it had told him something damning, because a man like Damian Falcone had learned long ago that the most dangerous people were rarely the ones with something ugly buried in their history. Sometimes, the most dangerous people were simply very good at leaving no history at all. He clicked over to the gate logs next, the automated record that tracked every badge in and every badge out of the estate to the minute, a system he had installed himself after a security review 3 years earlier and had barely glanced at since, and he began scrolling backward through 8 weeks of entries with the same cold attention he gave to a balance sheet before an acquisition. 6 in the morning, 8 in the evening, 6 in the morning again. The pattern held for the first several weeks, ordinary, unremarkable, exactly what a kitchen assistant's contract specified. And then, 3 weeks in, it broke. A Tuesday night entry with no corresponding exit until the following morning. He sat back slightly. He kept scrolling, and the pattern kept breaking. Again and again, a girl who was supposed to leave this house every evening at 6 o'clock, instead staying inside its walls long after the family had gone quiet, night after night, that no payroll record would ever show. And Damian Falcone, who trusted almost nothing in this world that he had not personally verified, felt the last of the warmth from that hallway drain out of him and leave only the question behind, sharper now and far more urgent than before. He didn't stop at the numbers on the screen. Damian pulled up the entire hiring file from the beginning. Not the summary Mrs. Whitfield still sent him every quarter, but the original file, complete with every approval signature and the employee codes behind each decision. And when the name of the final approver appeared, he sat perfectly still for several seconds. It wasn't Mrs. Whitfield. It wasn't anyone in the human resources department who normally handled lower positions such as kitchen assistants. The man who had signed the approval, who had personally made the confirming phone call, who had bypassed the entire standard interview process to bring Mia Doyle into the household within a single afternoon, was Salvatore Greco, the man who had stood behind his mother's shoulder since before Damian had been old enough to remember his father clearly. Damian closed the laptop and sat in the darkness for a long while, trying to put everything back into some kind of logical order, but there was no way to explain why his mother's old bodyguard had personally intervened in the hiring of a kitchen assistant. The next morning, he found Sal in the garage, where the older man still routinely inspected every vehicle before taking Isabella to her regular medical appointments. Damian didn't beat around the bush. "You personally approved Mia Doyle's file," he said, not as a question, but as an accusation laid before Sal like a sheet of evidence. Sal showed no surprise at all. He continued drying the rearview mirror with the cloth in his hand, slowly, as though the statement wasn't worth making him stop. "I did," he replied without looking up. "Why?" Damian asked, his voice sharper now, the kind of voice that would have made anyone else in the family immediately lower his head and obey. Sal finally looked up at him, meeting his eyes with the calm gaze of a man who had served long enough to no longer fear the power of anyone who carried the Falcone name. "That's your mother's business," he said. "It's not my place to explain." "My mother knew her before this," Damian said, and this time it wasn't a question either. Sal said nothing, a deliberate silence, the kind that belonged to a man who knew the answer perfectly well, but had promised someone that he would never speak it aloud. "I'm the head of this family," Damian said, stepping one pace closer. "Every decision in this house ultimately comes through me, including whatever you're hiding." Sal set the cloth down. He straightened, and for the first time in the conversation, his eyes no longer belonged to an employee, but to a man who had lived long enough to have nothing left to fear. "I've served 3 generations of this family," he said, his voice still calm, but every word carrying the weight of stone. "I buried your father with my own hands, and the only loyalty I have left in this world belongs to one woman who has trusted me long enough to know with certainty that I'll never betray a promise. No matter what name the person standing before me carries." He paused for a beat, then continued, more slowly, almost gently. "Until then, you don't need to worry yourself too much over a maid. Rest easy, and trust Mrs. Issa." Then he turned back to his work, picked up the cloth and continued wiping the mirror as though the conversation had never happened, leaving Damian standing there in the cold garage, both hands clenched inside the pockets of his coat, realizing that for the first time in many years, there was a door inside his own home that his power could not open, and that, more than any line of data on the screen the night before, was what truly unsettled him. That morning, without waiting for any further evidence, Damian summoned Mia to his study, a room paneled in dark oak that few employees had ever set foot in, and when she appeared in the doorway, still carrying a trace of flour from the kitchen on her hands, he realized he was looking at her with an entirely different expression from the passing glance he usually gave the other employees in the house, an assessing, wary gaze, searching for some sign that something was wrong. She stood straight in the doorway, neither lowering her head nor asking permission to speak, simply waiting for him to speak first, and that calmness, instead of reassuring him, only made him more certain that she was hiding something. "You've stayed in this house overnight at least 8 times over the past 3 weeks, he said without beating around the bush, laying the matter on the desk like an indictment. "It's not on the payroll, and there's no permission request from you." Mia didn't deny it. "That's right," she replied, her voice so calm that it irritated him more than any excuse could have. "What do you do on those nights?" he asked next, "that you don't need anyone to know about?" "I stay because your mother sometimes wakes up around 2 o'clock in the morning frightened," Mia said, "and there's no one else in this house who will sit with her until she falls asleep again." I didn't think that was something I needed permission for. Damian felt the answer strike directly at the place he didn't want touched, and he responded by tightening his voice. "You were hired to cook and manage the food inventory," he said. "Not to interfere in my family's private affairs, and I've just learned that my mother's head of security personally arranged for you to be here, something no one in this house has been able to explain to me. So I think it'd be best if you packed your things before the end of today." Mia didn't flinch, but something in her eyes briefly fell, not because she was afraid of losing her job, but as though she were thinking of someone else who would be hurt by this decision more than she would. She hadn't had a chance to answer when the door behind her swung open, and the sound of wheelchair wheels rolling across the wooden floor rang out clearly through the tense silence of the room. Isabella pushed herself inside, refusing to wait for anyone to help her, the gauntness of her face carrying a determination Damian had rarely seen since the day she fell ill. "What are you planning to do?" she asked, though it was obvious she'd heard enough that she didn't need an answer. Damian straightened instinctively, the instinct of a son standing before his mother, even though he was running an entire empire outside this room. "I'm just protecting this house, Mom," he said. "I don't understand what's happening, and no one is willing to explain it to me." Isabella wheeled herself closer, stopping directly between her son and Mia, as though her frail body alone were enough to become a wall between them. "You want to understand," she said, her voice much weaker than Damian remembered, but every word still carrying the weight of a stone. "Then give me more time to tell you myself, in my own way, when I'm ready. You can send her away today, Damian, but if you do it before I've had the chance to explain everything to you, you'll lose something you'll never have the chance to get back, and I don't have much time left to give you a second chance." It wasn't the first time Damian had heard those words, because for the 7 months since the doctors had confirmed that his mother had advanced cancer with a prognosis of only 1 to 2 years, the phrase, "I don't have much time left," had become a silent ghost hanging over every conversation between mother and son, a truth that he, Sal, and the family's private doctor all knew well but had never spoken aloud in front of outsiders. Only this time, when the words were spoken not in an examination room or during one of her routine checkups, but right here, in the middle of a confrontation over a maid, their weight pressed down on him in an entirely different way, as though his mother had just used the little time she had left as her final bargaining chip, and that left Damian more heartsick and helpless than he had ever felt before. He looked at his mother, then over at Mia, who had remained completely still, without offering a single word of defense for herself from beginning to end, and he understood that no matter how much more he questioned them, neither of the two women in this room would reveal anything else until they decided for themselves that the time had come. "All right," he finally said, his voice carrying more exhaustion than agreement. "She can stay, but I want to know the truth, Mom. Soon." Isabella gave a single, brief nod, like a negotiation that had ended exactly as she intended, then gestured for Mia to wheel her out of the room, leaving Damian alone behind his desk, his hand still resting on the file he had prepared to use against her, now rendered useless, and in his heart, that concession brought him no sense of relief at all, only made the question in his mind more urgent than ever. Damian didn't truly believe in the decisiveness of his own words when he had spoken them, and it wasn't until the door to the sitting room had closed behind his mother, when he was alone in the vast room with nothing but the echo of the words he had just spoken, that he finally admitted something to himself that he would never say aloud in front of anyone, not even his mother, which was that from the very beginning he had never truly intended to send that girl away. The ultimatum he had given, the cold, resolute manner he had deliberately displayed in front of Isabella, all of it had simply been a test, the only way he could think of to force a mother as guarded as she was to reveal her genuine reaction, because no one in this house was willing to explain to him what was really happening, not Sal, and certainly not his own mother, and a man accustomed to holding every card in his hands couldn't bear the feeling of being left in the dark inside his own home. He trusted his mother's judgment, which had never been in question, just as he couldn't deny the strange sense of peace he felt whenever that girl was somewhere in the house, a quietness this home had been missing for a very long time. But trust didn't mean it was easy to accept being kept in the dark, and it was precisely the feeling that some truth was hiding beneath the roof of his own home, something he wasn't allowed to touch, that kept him from finding any peace. It lingered in his mind throughout that night, followed him into a restless sleep, and was still there when he woke the next morning, sitting behind the wheel of his car on the way to pick up Vivian, an unanswered question he knew he wouldn't be able to push aside until he found the truth. The following evening, Damian drove himself to pick up Vivian Sinclair, a habit he still kept despite having a private driver, because it was one of the rare moments during the week when he could be alone with his own thoughts before stepping into an evening filled with social formalities. A red light held the car at a deserted intersection, and in that quiet moment, he broke the silence with a rare confession that even he hadn't intended to make. "A new girl is working in the kitchen," he said, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "My mother likes her so much that when I tried to let her go because of a few things that didn't add up, my mother practically declared that she'd protect her to the very end." He shook his head, half confused and half helpless. "I don't understand why Mom is so determined to keep her. But anyway, you'll meet her tonight. She'll be serving dinner. If Mom is happy, that's all that matters. I don't want to make a big deal out of it." Vivian sat beside him, keeping the same composed expression she always wore, but inside her sharp mind, the machinery had already begun turning from his very first sentence. "How long has she been working here?" she asked, her voice gentle, as though she were simply keeping the conversation alive to make the drive less tedious. "About 2 months, Damian replied. "Who referred her for the job?" Vivian asked next, and Damian, without giving it much thought, told her that his mother's longtime head of security had personally arranged it, a detail for which he still hadn't found a satisfactory explanation. Vivian carefully stored that answer away in her mind, the way she had always done with every seemingly insignificant piece of information throughout her career, but she wasn't truly worried. In the calculations of a woman accustomed to marriages built on interest and status, a maid couldn't possibly be a threat to anything important. At most, this was simply an interesting detail worth keeping an eye on for her own amusement, hardly something worth taking seriously. "She must be a wonderful cook," Vivian said with a small smile, closing the subject with an entirely harmless remark. And Damian, relieved that she didn't ask anything more, continued driving toward the restaurant without realizing that he had just planted a tiny seed in the worst possible patch of ground. Dinner was held in the mansion's grand dining room, where Isabella had insisted on sitting at the actual table and eating a proper meal instead of having a tray brought up to her room as usual, and she had also insisted that Mia remain in the room throughout dinner, claiming that she needed someone to personally attend to her special diet, though everyone understood that it was merely an excuse. Vivian couldn't hide the brief flash of displeasure in her eyes when she saw the girl in her kitchen uniform standing near the dining table longer than an ordinary server normally would, but she was too clever to let that reaction show too plainly. In between casual conversations about the weather and the Sinclair family's charitable projects, Vivian suddenly turned to Mia with a charming smile, the same smile she used at fundraising events to make the person in front of her feel as though they were receiving her special attention. "Mia, right?" she said, her voice sweet enough to sound like nothing more than ordinary social courtesy. "Why don't you tell everyone how you found this job? It really is such a rare stroke of good fortune, getting hired just when the family needed someone so devoted." The question fell lightly onto the dining table like a leaf, but Isabella, who was holding a glass of water in her hand, paused for a beat before setting it down, while Sal, standing near the doorway out of his longtime guard's habit of vigilance, slightly tilted his head toward the table without changing his posture. Mia, completely unaware that she had just come under scrutiny, answered honestly and simply that she'd been referred by an acquaintance and felt fortunate to have been given the opportunity. Vivian nodded, still smiling, then added gently, as though she were merely thinking aloud. "It's just that I find it a little unusual. Normally a family like this wouldn't have a kitchen employee remain at the table this long during a private family dinner. Perhaps we should reconsider the arrangement a little, just to avoid any unnecessary misunderstandings later." She said it in the tone of someone offering sincere advice for the good of everyone involved, without the slightest hint of sharpness in her words, making it sound to anyone listening like nothing more than an innocent observation. But Isabella understood better than anyone that the remark wasn't innocent at all, that the young woman sitting across from her had just, through instinct and an almost instinctive sharpness, come dangerously close to the very place she was most desperate to protect, without realizing that she was holding a thread capable of bringing down an entire secret that had been hidden for decades. She smoothly changed the subject, praising the fish prepared that day as being far better than the previous weeks, and the dinner table continued in its ordinary rhythm. But beneath that polished surface of courtesy, Isabella was truly wary of the woman her son was about to marry for the first time, not because Vivian knew anything, but precisely because she knew nothing at all and could still make the entire room hold its breath with nothing more than a question that seemed, on the surface, to be the most harmless thing in the world. The question Vivian had asked at the dinner table the night before remained suspended in Damian's mind throughout the following morning, and by noon, when the work at the office had settled down for a while, he decided to drive to her apartment instead of calling, because there were some things he needed to ask while looking directly into her eyes. Vivian greeted him with her familiar smile and invited him into the living room with a glass of red wine already poured, as though she'd known he was coming, and when Damian asked her directly why she'd asked Mia that question at the dinner table, Vivian set her wineglass down, looked straight at him without the slightest hesitation, and said, "I was just curious, Damian. It was a normal question anyone could ask a new housekeeper, so why are you making such a big deal out of it, or is there something you need to tell me?" He explained that he simply found it strange because the question had seemed more pointed than necessary, but Vivian only gave a soft laugh, tilted her head, and answered with an almost flawless gentleness, "Maybe it's because I noticed your mother treats her differently, and as someone who's about to become your family's daughter-in-law, I have every right to care about the people who are around my future mother-in-law, don't I?" She continued in a soft but certain voice, saying that she completely understood if Damian felt she was being overly critical, and she apologized if it had made dinner uncomfortable. Then she reached out and lightly touched his arm, her eyes carrying just enough carefully calculated hurt to make anyone soften, and Damian, though a small doubt still remained inside him, couldn't find anything in her explanation he could argue against. So he nodded and let the matter pass, even though the feeling that something wasn't right remained somewhere inside him, something he couldn't put a name to. That same evening, when Damian returned home and stopped by his mother's room as he had made a habit of doing ever since learning about her illness, Isabella was sitting by the window, turning the pages of an old photo album, and when she saw him enter, she waved him closer and pointed to a yellowed photograph of him as a little boy sitting on the steps behind the house. "Damian, I've been looking for something, and I still can't find it. Do you remember that little wooden toy you used to carry around when you were about 7 or 8, the one you wouldn't ever let go of, even when you were sleeping?" she asked, her voice sounding as though she were simply bringing up an old memory in passing. Damian stopped, the teacup in his hand suddenly suspended in midair, because it was something he had never told anyone, not even his mother, a gift from a little girl who had lived next door and was much younger than he was, something he'd kept hidden in the drawer of his desk for more than 20 years, a small secret he'd never told anyone about. And even when someone happened to ask about it, he always avoided the question and said that he'd lost it long ago, simply so no one would have a reason to touch it or ask any further questions about it. "How do you know about that?" he asked, his voice slowing, a note of caution entering it, and Isabella immediately realized she'd revealed something she shouldn't have. She quickly lowered her eyes to the photo album, pretending to be absorbed in searching for another photograph, then answered in a voice as light as a passing breeze, "Maybe I heard someone mention it. I'm getting old, you know. Sometimes I remember things, and sometimes I don't. Maybe I just dreamed it." But Damian wasn't the kind of man who could easily let an evasive answer like that pass, and in that moment, as he watched his mother deliberately avoid his gaze, a strange feeling rose inside him, not anger, but a profound confusion, as though some invisible thread were quietly connecting him to a fragment of a memory that even he had never fully been able to explain, and the question of how his mother Casey knows such a private detail from his childhood. That question continued echoing through his mind, refusing to let go, until Damian realized that instead of continuing to probe his mother with indirect questions she would always skillfully evade, perhaps he needed a different approach, something more direct, something easier, something that would bring him closer to that girl so he could find the answer for himself without anyone having to tell him outright, and he thought that perhaps it was time for him to do something. On Saturday morning, Damian drove Mia himself to the flea market near the harbor to buy ingredients for the weekend dinner at Isabella's request, something that should have been left to Sal, but he had volunteered for the task for one reason alone. He needed more time to observe this girl somewhere his mother wasn't watching, to hear how she answered unexpected questions when she didn't have time to prepare herself. Sitting in the car, Mia glanced over at him, unable to hide her surprise, and asked him directly, "Just the other day you wanted to fire me, so why are you personally taking me to the market today?" The question made Damian pause for a second, before he answered in an indifferent tone. "My mother asked me to, and I thought I should see how you work outside the kitchen." Throughout the drive and as they moved past the rows of stalls, he asked her all kinds of things, from where she'd learned to cook and why she'd chosen this job, to who was still in her family, and Mia answered everything with such natural honesty that at times she made him laugh without meaning to, like when she told him about the first time she'd burned an entire pot of soup because she'd been too distracted listening to the radio, or when she bluntly pointed out that the salmon at the stall on the left was much fresher than the salmon on the right, even though it cost a little more. And Damian, a man accustomed to reading people through their caution and calculation, found absolutely no sign of anything false in the way she spoke. As they passed a small stall selling handmade wooden crafts at the end of the market, Mia stopped and picked up a little bird roughly carved from a piece of dark wood, studying it in the palm of her hand with a faintly sad smile before speaking almost absently, as though she were talking more to herself than to Damian. "My father once carved one exactly like this for me when I was very little. I don't remember when I lost it, probably when my family moved away. I just remember being so sad when I realized it was gone." Damian stopped dead amid the passing crowd, his hand instinctively lifting toward the little wooden bird she was holding, before stopping halfway, a strange, nameless sensation running down his spine, not the emergence of any specific memory, only a vague rush of emotion, as though someone had just touched a door that had been locked inside his mind for a very long time. He stood there, unable to say a word, until Mia looked up at him and asked if he was all right. He quickly shook his head, bought the little wooden bird from the stall owner without explaining why, and quietly continued walking. On the drive home, his phone rang. Marcus called to report that the unusual financial discrepancy on the Sinclair family's company side still had no satisfactory explanation, even after he had spoken with Vivian's accountant twice, a small figure that had been repeating consistently for 3 straight months, and Damian, despite being behind the wheel, simply replied that they should keep monitoring it and report back, his mind now completely occupied by the tangled emotions stirred by the story of the wooden bird, rather than the accounting figures. That evening, after Isabella had returned to her room to rest and Mia had finished her work in the kitchen, Damian sat alone in his study, the desk lamp casting its light over the newly purchased wooden bird resting beside a stack of files, and almost without consciously intending to, his hand reached down and pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, where he kept a few old belongings from his childhood that he rarely touched. When the drawer opened, he froze at the sight of the small, worn wooden bird, still lying there exactly as it had for all these years, the wood having darkened with age, and beside it now sat the new bird he'd bought at the market that morning, 2 objects that seemed to have nothing to do with each other, and yet carried the same familiar fingerprint of the same pair of hands. He sat motionless for a very long time, turning the newly purchased wooden bird gently in his hand beneath the lamplight, and his mother's question from the previous week, the question about the small wooden toy she should never have known about, suddenly echoed back through his mind more clearly than ever, no longer a passing curiosity, but a preoccupation he knew he wouldn't be able to ignore until he found the answer. The following morning, an urgent call from the manager of the Falcone family's main restaurant in the Old Harbor district reported that a group of kitchen staff were threatening to walk out in the middle of preparations for the large party that evening, citing reduced working hours and unpaid overtime that had been promised to them, a situation that seemed minor on the surface but had come at an extremely sensitive time, with the joint venture contract between the two families about to be formally signed, forcing Damian to be there in person, and because Vivian, as the Sinclair representative in the deal, was also directly involved with the payroll fund for that department, she had to handle the matter alongside him. In the office behind the kitchen, amid the noise of the employees gathered outside the glass doors, Vivian sat down and tapped her red-painted fingers impatiently against the wooden desk, and when the manager nervously explained that most of the employees were ordinary workers who had been with the company for many years, she gave a quiet laugh, cold and brief, then spoke plainly without bothering to lower her voice, even though the office door was only partly closed. "Who do these people think they are to bargain with us? A few phone calls would be enough to replace every single one of them in an afternoon. I honestly don't understand why you have to sit here and listen to them complain." Damian froze and turned to look at her, his surprise mixed unmistakably with irritation, but before he could say anything, the manager, still holding the phone that was recording the meeting according to the company's internal procedure, something Vivian had no idea about, gave Damian a meaningful glance, and Damian immediately understood that the moment had been captured clearly, undeniable evidence of how Vivian truly viewed the people working under his family's command, completely different from the gentle, proper image she always presented in front of Isabella and the family's guests. At the same time, not far away, in Marcus's office, the numbers he had been tracking for the past 3 months finally came together into a clear picture. The small discrepancy that had repeatedly appeared in the joint venture accounts wasn't an accounting error as they had initially assumed, but a carefully arranged series of transactions, quietly diverting part of the profits from the joint project into a private account held in the name of the Sinclair family, carried out systematically from before the wedding date between Damian and Vivian had even been set, a carefully prepared financial escape route in case the marriage went nowhere or everything fell apart halfway through. Marcus called Damian immediately after Damian had just left the restaurant, his voice more serious than usual. "Damian, I need to see you privately. This isn't something I can discuss over the phone, and I think you should prepare yourself before you hear what I have to say." Sitting in his car with the recording he'd just received from the restaurant manager still displayed on his phone screen, Damian felt a slow, simmering anger rising in his chest, not only because of what he'd just witnessed, but also because he had a feeling that whatever Marcus was about to tell him would be far worse than this. And for the first time since the day of their engagement, he found himself completely uncertain about the woman he was about to call his wife. Marcus met Damian that very night in the family's private office, spreading out all the documents he'd gathered before him, every transaction, every figure marked in red, clearly proving that for the past 6 months, Vivian had been quietly directing her personal accountant to transfer small portions of the profits from the joint venture into an account held in the name of the Sinclair family, a plan calculated so carefully that without Marcus's persistence, it might never have been discovered. Damian sat in silence for a long while, his hand gripping the edge of the desk so tightly that his knuckles turned white. And in that moment, what stunned him wasn't really the numbers, but the question that kept drilling deeper into his mind. The realization that for nearly a year, he'd trusted a woman beside him whom he believed he understood. A woman he had once thought held at least some genuine affection for him, even though their engagement had begun as a matter of mutual benefit between the two families. And yet it turned out she'd been quietly preparing an escape route from the very beginning, as though there had never been a single moment when she truly saw him as anything more than a piece on the scale of mutual interests. He called Vivian and demanded that she meet him that very night, and when she entered the study looking as perfectly composed as ever, Damian felt his anger tangled with a confusion he'd never experienced before, because only yesterday the balance between them had still seemed exactly as it had throughout nearly the entire year, and yet in a single evening, everything had been overturned so completely and so quickly that he had barely had time to react. He didn't beat around the bush. He played the recording back for her, letting her hear her own contemptuous voice, then placed the financial statements in front of her and spoke in a voice he struggled to keep calm despite the storm boiling inside him. "I think we both know this isn't a marriage anymore, but simply a business arrangement for which you've prepared an exit strategy a long time ago, Vivian." Vivian didn't panic or try to deny anything as he'd expected. She simply looked straight at him, the corner of her mouth lifting into a faint smile, and answered in a voice so calm it was chilling. "Then consider it a way of saving both of us a lot of unnecessary time and tears, Damian, because this marriage was only a calculation of mutual benefits between two families from the very beginning anyway, wasn't it? Or did you really believe it was something more?" Her words cut straight through Damian's pride like a knife, not because he still loved her, but because they exposed the naked truth that all this time he'd been naively believing in feelings that had never existed, and he rose to his feet, his voice turning completely cold. "You can leave this house right now." Vivian gathered her handbag, and just as she reached the door, she turned back, her eyes passing over him with a cold flash of malice. "Oh, and as for that little maid you and your mother are so fond of, I'd advise you to be careful. Maybe she's got plans just like mine. She's just better at hiding them." Damian didn't answer. He simply stood there and watched her leave in silence, his anger still burning in his chest. But the following morning, when Marcus called in an urgent voice to report that an anonymous article had just appeared on a gossip site specializing in the private affairs of the wealthy, accusing the Falcone family of being manipulated by an unknown maid who was exploiting their trust for financial gain, accompanied by several anonymous comments aimed directly at Mia, Damian finally understood that Vivian's warning the night before hadn't been an offhand remark at all, but the final act of retaliation she'd quietly set in motion before leaving. And for the first time since everything had begun, he felt with absolute clarity that now he would have to be the one to stand between Mia and the entire outside world. The call from Marcus the following morning brought with it a longer list than Damian had expected. Not only the original anonymous article, but now 3 longtime business partners of the Falcone family had called to express their concerns, and the company's communications manager had requested an emergency meeting that very morning to discuss how to contain the damage. In the conference room, the communications manager, an older man who had worked for the Falcone family since Damian's father's time, laid several options out before him, and the one mentioned most often, the one he considered the safest, was to have the maid named Mia temporarily leave the estate for a while, officially state that she was simply an ordinary employee with no special connection to the family, and let the matter die down with time before the rumors could take deeper root among the media and business partners. "This isn't a personal matter, Damian. This is a matter of the entire family's image, and I believe you understand that better than anyone," the manager said, his voice calm but firm, and several others around the table nodded in agreement, their eyes turning toward Damian as they waited for his decision. Damian remained silent for a long while, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface of the table, and in his mind, the image of Mia standing in the kitchen the morning before, her hands dusted with flour, smiling at him with absolutely no guardedness when he walked past her, came back more clearly than any number or article he'd just read. He still knew nothing about her true identity. had no explanation from his mother about the mysterious connection between her and the young woman, had no answer to the question about the little wooden bird or anything else quietly unfolding behind the closed doors of his family, and precisely because of that, the decision he was about to make would be based entirely on what he knew for certain at that moment, not because she possessed some secret that made her special, but simply because she didn't deserve to be treated that way. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere in the room, so decisive that several people present looked up at him. "Mia isn't going anywhere, and I won't let anyone in this house, or any partner outside it, treat her like something that can simply be thrown away because of a few anonymous lines with no evidence." The communications manager frowned slightly, about to say something more, but Damian had already risen to his feet, signaling that the meeting was over, and he added, his voice softer but no less firm, that instead of retreating, the company would issue a public statement rejecting the rumors, affirming that all the allegations were baseless, and that anyone who continued spreading false information would face legal consequences from the family's personal attorneys. That afternoon, as news spread that the Falcone family had officially spoken out in defense of an ordinary employee against the storm of public scrutiny, quite a few people in business circles were surprised, because that wasn't how a powerful man like Damian usually handled matters. But for Damian himself, as he stood by the window of his office and looked down at the garden where Mia was working beside Isabella, his mother gently showing her how to mound the soil around the base of a small tree, he knew he didn't need to understand every secret surrounding the young woman to know that this was the right choice, a choice based entirely on what he felt in that moment, not on anything from the past that he had yet to discover. That evening, just as sunset settled over the city of Newport and the last streaks of sunlight painted the horizon orange, Isabella asked Sal to wheel her up to the rooftop terrace above the estate, a place rarely used except on special occasions, and she asked Damian and Mia to come up and meet her there, saying that it was time for her to tell them both something she'd kept in her heart for far too long. When Damian and Mia stepped onto the terrace together, the sea breeze gently stirred the thin blanket covering Isabella's legs, and she motioned for them to sit in the two chairs placed beside her. Her eyes moved from one face to the other, lingering a little longer on Mia, and then she began, her voice slow but steady, as though she'd rehearsed this story in her mind more times than she could count. "When I was young, I had the dearest friend in the world, so close that people used to call us childhood sweethearts, even though there was never any romantic feeling between us, simply a friendship that had grown alongside us from the days when we used to play together down on this harbor, back when both our families were still poor and lived beside each other in the same neighborhood." Mia sat quietly, listening at first with ordinary curiosity, but when Isabella mentioned the harbor, the image of a boy growing up among ships and the smell of salt in the sea, something strange began to stir inside her, a vague coincidence she didn't yet dare put a name to. Isabella continued, explaining that when she grew older and stepped into the world of the Falcone family, a world filled with danger and hostility where anyone connected to her could become a target, she'd made the painful decision to deliberately keep her distance from that friend, cutting off regular contact, not because their friendship had faded, but precisely because she cherished him and his little family too deeply to drag them into dangers she couldn't escape herself. "I simply watched from a distance, through a few people I trusted. I knew he had a daughter, I knew the little girl grew up healthy, and I told myself that was enough. I had no right to step into their lives again." By then, Mia's fingers had begun to tighten gently around the hem of her clothes, her breathing slowing, and she glanced quietly toward Damian as though searching for something to steady the intuition that was gradually becoming clearer inside her, while Damian, still more focused on his mother's story than on watching Mia, hadn't noticed anything unusual. Isabella continued, her voice catching as she explained that when she'd received word that her friend had died in an accident at the very harbor where he'd worked all his life, She had gone to pay her respects many years ago, but she'd stayed only briefly, standing quietly at the back of the crowd for a few short minutes before leaving immediately, so as not to cause any further trouble for his family while they were overwhelmed with grief, and she said that this had been the last meaningful thing a friend could quietly do for another. At those words, Mia instinctively raised a hand to cover her mouth, her eyes widening as the scattered details, the harbor, the accident, the years, began to come together into a shape far too familiar, so familiar that she almost didn't dare trust her own intuition, and she whispered, her voice trembling, "Who are you talking about?" Isabella looked directly at her, and this time she didn't speak in circles anymore. She said each word clearly. "I'm talking about Patrick Doyle, your father, Mia." Then she continued, her voice trembling with emotion, explaining that on the ride home from the funeral that day, she'd cried more than she'd ever cried in all the years before, and right there in that car, she'd made a promise to herself that she'd try to help the people he'd left behind grieve a little less, live a little better, within whatever power she had. "And that's why I wanted you here, beside me." The space on the rooftop seemed to freeze for a moment. Mia burst into tears immediately, both hands covering her face as the tears she'd held back for so long finally poured out beyond her control, while Damian, only when that name was spoken, only when he saw Mia's reaction, finally watched all the scattered pieces that had been circling through his mind for weeks suddenly flare into place. The question about the wooden bird, Sal's startled expression, his mother's strange protectiveness toward a newly hired maid, all of it appearing at once with such startling clarity that he let out a breath of astonishment and turned to look at Mia with an entirely different expression. Isabella's trembling hands opened a small wooden box resting on her lap. She took out an old photograph, yellowed and faded with time, and handed it to Mia. In the photograph were two children sitting on the steps outside a simple wooden house, a little girl with curly hair grinning as she hugged a small dog, while beside her a little boy pointed toward the camera. On the back of the photograph was faded handwriting recording the names of Isabella and Pat, along with the year the picture had been taken. Mia held the photograph in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the young face of the father she'd lost, and her tears fell onto the old picture, dampening one corner. Isabella took Mia's hand, her voice earnest. "I don't know how much time I have left, Mia, but everything I've done all this time has come from my heart. I wanted to help you, a good, hard-working young woman, just like your father was back then. I can only help you as much as I'm able, and that's also something I want to fulfill before this illness can take me away farther than I ever wanted." Hearing that, Mia's tears flowed even more heavily. She rose abruptly from her chair, both hands pressing against her chest as though trying to contain the sob rising in her throat, and said through her tears, "Please excuse me, I need some quiet." Then she turned and ran away, her figure gradually disappearing behind the door leading down the stairs, leaving Damian and Isabella alone on the rooftop beneath the dim lights. Damian remained silent for a long while, then slowly turned toward his mother, his voice gentle but filled with emotion. "So that's what all my patience and curiosity were leading me toward, to hear this. So many strange things have happened all this time that every question in my head just kept hanging there, and I never had enough time to piece them together into one complete answer." Isabella only smiled faintly and didn't answer right away, and at that moment Damian suddenly stopped, as though something had just flashed through his mind. He turned and looked directly at his mother, then asked, his voice slow and somewhat cautious, "So bringing Mia close to you, having her come work in this house, all of it was deliberately arranged by you. Then what about Vivian? Could it be that—" Isabella only smiled softly, then slowly turned toward her son and answered in a calm voice, "I only helped you see the truth sooner, Damian. I'm sorry that lately I've felt a little pressure at times. Perhaps I moved faster than I should have." But before she could finish, Damian stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his mother, his voice breaking through tears. "Don't say that anymore, Mom. I'm sorry I let you handle all of this alone, but now you have me and Mia beside you. You're going to get stronger, I promise you that." The sunset on the rooftop that evening was strangely beautiful, the final rays of daylight bathing the sky above the sea in shades of golden orange, and mother and son remained there together for a long time, neither saying another word, simply leaning against each other in the rare closeness they could both feel, a closeness that suddenly made Damian realize how long it had been since he'd felt anything like this beside his mother. For several days after that evening on the rooftop, Mia almost completely withdrew into herself. She still woke early to prepare breakfast, still completed every task in the kitchen according to her usual schedule, but the natural openness that had once lived in her eyes was no longer there, and whenever Isabella asked Sal to wheel her into the kitchen as she used to, Mia always found some work-related excuse to avoid her, then quietly retreating into the pantry or the auxiliary kitchen area. That night, when everyone in the house had fallen asleep, Mia sat alone in the small room that had been arranged for her, holding the old photograph Isabella had given her against her chest, and memories she'd thought she'd buried deep inside suddenly came rushing back. Not memories of her father, but memories of her years in Hartford, of her stepmother's eyes looking at her as though she were a burden that needed to be properly dealt with, of family meetings where she was always the subject being discussed as a problem that needed to be solved rather than a person with feelings of her own. And now that she knew even her presence in this house, this job, these warm family meals, had all come as the result of a quiet arrangement made by a woman she'd never truly known, that old wound seemed to be torn open all over again, hurting no less than it had the first time. The next morning, when Isabella sent for Mia to come to her private room for a conversation, Mia stood in the doorway without fully stepping inside, and when Isabella gently asked whether she was all right, Mia answered, her voice trying to remain calm but still trembling with emotion. "I don't know whether I should thank you for giving me a job, or be angry because I was never given a choice. I came to this city alone, found work on my own, and stood on my own 2 feet, and I thought that at least this time I'd manage to do that without relying on anyone. But it turns out that from the very beginning, I was a piece on a chessboard someone had been quietly moving without me ever knowing." Isabella listened, pain shining in her eyes, and tried to explain that she'd never intended to treat Mia like a piece on a chessboard, that everything she'd done had come from genuine affection for the friend she'd lost and for his daughter. But Mia only shook her head. "I believe you meant well. I don't hate you, and I don't hate this family either, but you have to understand, I've spent years proving to myself that I'm not a responsibility someone else needs to manage for me, and now I need time to sort everything out in my head." Isabella fell silent and nodded, though a trace of worry passed through her eyes that she tried to conceal, and Mia added, her voice firmer now, that for about the next week, she only wanted to do exactly what was written in her original employment contract, cooking and managing the food supplies, nothing more, and she hoped Isabella would understand if she couldn't come by for the warm, personal conversations they'd shared before. After leaving Isabella's room, Mia walked down the hallway just as Damian stepped out of his study. He was about to speak to her, but when he saw her expression, he simply stepped quietly to the side to let her pass, and Mia walked by without saying a word, her eyes fixed straight ahead, neither avoiding him nor carrying the familiar warmth she'd once had during those mornings at the market or those chance encounters in the kitchen. And Damian stood there watching her figure disappear down the hall, feeling with absolute clarity that a new distance had just formed between them, a distance he knew he couldn't rush to erase, because this was no longer simply a matter between him and her, but the wound of a young woman who had grown far too accustomed to having other people decide her fate for her, and the only thing he could do now was step back, wait, and hope that time would help her find the peace she needed. A week had passed since the day Mia had asked to retreat into a quiet space of her own, and throughout those 7 days, Damian kept the promise he had made to himself not to seek her out, only watching her silently from a distance, seeing that she still came to the kitchen on time and still carried out her duties meticulously, yet her face grew more solemn with each passing day, and the house, though no one said it aloud, had taken on an unusual stillness. That afternoon, when he saw Mia alone taking inventory in the pantry behind the kitchen, Damian decided to step inside, keeping just enough distance between them so she wouldn't feel cornered, and he spoke first, his voice gentle, carefully avoiding anything related to the feelings between them, because both he and Mia understood that they had only just discovered that they had once been childhood friends, and neither of them had given a name to anything else between them. "I didn't come here to ask you about what happened the other day," he said. "I just want you to know something about my mother." Mia stopped what she was doing and turned to look at him without saying anything, simply waiting. "Ever since you stopped going to her room, she can barely eat anything. Sal told me that every morning she asks the same question, asking whether you're planning to come by that day, and when she hears the answer is no, she simply turns toward the window and stays that way for the rest of the morning. I'm not telling you this to pressure you into doing anything. I just think you should know." Mia lowered her head, her fingers tightening around the inventory notebook in her hands, and a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady, faint hum of the ventilation fan in the pantry. "I know you need time, and I have no intention of taking that away from you," Damian continued. "But my mother doesn't have as much time as other people do, and I think you know that better than anyone." Mia looked up, her eyes red with tears, and replied, her voice catching in her throat. "I'm not angry with Isabella. I was never angry with her. I just need time to understand what happened to my own life." Damian nodded and said nothing more. He simply stood there and waited, and after a long while, Mia let out a quiet sigh and placed the notebook down on the table. "All right, I'll go back to see her. Not because I understand everything yet, but because I don't want to leave her to endure anything else alone. She's already suffered enough." Damian gave a small nod, relief slowly finding its way into his chest. But before he could thank her, Mia looked at him, something fragile and complicated in her eyes, and added in a voice that grew softer, "I still don't know what to think about the fact that we once—" She stopped there, leaving the sentence unfinished, as though even she couldn't find the right words for what she was trying to say. Damian gave a quiet laugh, a rare, genuinely relaxed smile, and replied, "Mia, having you here hasn't only helped Mom Isa, it has helped me too." With that, he turned away somewhat awkwardly and started walking, calling back over his shoulder as he went, "We'll see each other again soon, okay?" Mia remained alone in the pantry, watching his figure disappear from view, and then she broke into a bright, genuine smile, as though something heavy had just been lifted from her heart, a small flicker of happiness finding its way into her chest and slowly, quietly growing larger. That evening, after the work in the kitchen was finished, Damian went to where Mia was sitting on the back porch, carrying the small wooden bird he had bought at the market that day, and he placed it on the wooden table in front of her without saying a word, simply watching her reaction in silence. Mia picked up the little bird, slowly turning it in the palm of her hand beneath the warm yellow light spilling from the window, and when her fingers brushed over the carved lines on its wings, she suddenly stopped, narrowing her eyes as though she were trying to remember something, then looked up at Damian, her voice filled with surprise. "These grain patterns, the way the craftsman carved across each thin layer of wood on the wings. This is the carving style my father used to use. He taught me how to recognize it when I was very little. He said it was how you could tell a genuine piece made by the hands of a skilled craftsman from the mass-produced things sold at market stalls." Damian remained silent for a moment, then told her that the craftsman at the stall that day had said, when Damian asked about buying it, that this carving technique had been passed down from an old woodworker in the Harbor District, a man who had taught the trade to many young craftsmen in the area before he passed away. And when she heard that, Mia slowly raised a hand to cover her mouth, her eyes shining with emotion, but she didn't burst into tears as she had before. Instead, she simply smiled, a smile that was both warm and touched with longing. "I'm happier knowing this than I am sad," she said. "It feels as though my father still left something behind in this world, even though he isn't here anymore." Damian reached into the pocket of his coat and took out another wooden bird, older than the first, its wood darkened by the passing years, placing it beside the one he had just bought, and said, his voice slightly hesitant, "There's something I've never told anyone, not even my mother. I've kept a bird exactly like this since I was a child, a gift from a little girl who lived next door. I've kept it in the drawer of my desk for more than 20 years. Whenever anyone asked about it, I always said I'd lost it." Mia picked up the old wooden bird and examined it carefully, then suddenly froze, her eyes widening. This is the one I carved back then. I was always convinced I'd lost it when we moved, and I blamed myself for years because I'd dropped the last gift I'd ever carved with my own hands for my friend." She looked at Damian, her voice trembling, half disbelieving and half overwhelmed. "So all these years, you were the one who kept it." The two of them sat silently beside each other for a long while, the air between them carrying a strange quality that they both felt but neither dared to name, part embarrassment between two adults who had only known each other for a few months, and part an inexplicable closeness, as though they had known each other for far longer, since a childhood they had only just discovered had truly belonged to both of them. Mia broke the silence first, her voice still carrying a trace of emotion. "I didn't think you remembered that much about that time. You were so young back then. I always thought memories like those would fade over the years." Damian gave a faint smile, his eyes gazing into the darkness of the garden. "Maybe because that was the purest time of my entire childhood, before I grew up and was forced to step into the world my father left behind, a world that had no room for carefree afternoons like those anymore. So, maybe because it was so rare, I remember every little detail so clearly, as though my mind was trying to hold on to it as something precious it didn't want to lose." At that moment, a gentle breeze swept through, sending several sheets of paper fluttering across the table. Mia quickly reached out to hold them down, and in the midst of her hurried movement, she accidentally leaned toward Damian, causing her shoulder to brush lightly against his for a brief second. They both laughed at their clumsiness, and that shared laughter made Damian realize more clearly than ever that the strange sense of comfort he always felt whenever he was near Mia, the feeling he had always told himself was simply the reassurance of knowing she was his childhood friend, was actually growing into something he wasn't ready to name. He found himself clearing his throat softly and turning his face away slightly, trying to hide the sudden embarrassment rising inside him. Mia looked at him, something in her eyes softening, and said quietly, "I don't remember your face clearly from back then either. I only vaguely remember there was a boy older than me who used to play with me somewhere near our home, but hearing you tell it this way, I think I understand why, when I first met you, I had that strange feeling of familiarity that I couldn't explain." Damian turned to look at her, a feeling rising inside him that he hadn't allowed himself to fully experience since the day he learned the truth, not quite love, but something warmer and more genuine than any relationship he'd ever had, and he said slowly, as though carefully choosing every word, "Maybe that's why. From the very beginning, I felt there was something about you that kept me from treating you like any other new person in the house, even though I was deeply suspicious of you at the time. Mia laughed softly at his unexpected honesty, and the atmosphere between them grew a little lighter, even though they both understood that this was only the first step in learning to see each other, not as two strangers who had just discovered a shared past, but as two people slowly finding their way back to a connection that had once existed, and perhaps, though neither of them said it aloud, was beginning to become something more. Before leaving the porch to go inside, Damian picked up both wooden birds and handed them back to Mia, telling her that she should keep them because they belonged to her more than they belonged to him, and Mia accepted them, gently holding them close in her palms as her eyes followed Damian's figure disappearing into the house. Her heart filled with emotions she knew she would need more time to put into words, but for the first time since learning the truth, she felt lighter, as though some part of her had begun to understand that not everything that happened in life was the result of some cold arrangement, but that some things were quiet threads of love that someone had carefully kept alive for all those years. That Sunday, Isabella insisted on returning in person to the old neighborhood near the harbor, where she and Pat Doyle had grown up together, and where Damian himself, as a teenager, had once come to spend time with a younger little neighbor named Mia during the rare afternoons when he was allowed a break from the family's business. Sal drove all three of them there, and the narrow road leading into the old neighborhood still retained a few familiar traces, even though most of the wooden houses from those days had been replaced by newer structures. When the car stopped in front of an empty plot of land where a small, weathered house still stood under the care of relatives of the Doyle family, Isabella asked Sal to push her wheelchair toward the back garden, where a small wooden treehouse built into an old oak remained, badly worn by the passing years, but with its main wooden frame still standing firmly. When Mia saw the treehouse, she instinctively raised a hand to cover her mouth, as hazy memories of a place where she had once climbed and laughed as a little girl suddenly came rushing back with startling clarity. And Damian, standing beside her, also fell silent for a moment at the sight of something so familiar that he had thought he'd forgotten long ago. Isabella suggested that the two of them repair the treehouse together, saying that she wanted to see it brought back to life one more time before she no longer had the strength to come here again, and Damian, though he rarely did this kind of hands-on work, still rolled up his sleeves and joined Mia in gathering the rotten wooden boards to replace them, sawing and hammering under Isabella's occasional instructions as she watched from beneath the tree. While they worked, there were moments when Damian's and Mia's hands nearly touched as they held the same board, and both of them would quietly pull back, neither saying a word, exchanging only a glance before quickly lowering their eyes and returning to the work, the awkwardness between them no longer carrying the feeling of unfamiliarity it once had, but instead mingling with a warmth neither of them could quite name. At one point, Mia lifted a hand to brush a loose strand of hair from her forehead, unintentionally leaving a streak of sawdust across her cheek, and Damian, unable to stop himself, reached out to brush it away for her, but then stopped halfway, his fingers hovering only a few inches from her face. Mia noticed the gesture and stood perfectly still, looking directly at him, a sentence seeming to rise to her lips before she swallowed it back and simply said, "Thank you. I can do it myself," her voice trembling slightly. Damian withdrew his hand and gave a small nod, a vague sense of regret slipping quietly into his heart, even though he himself didn't know what exactly he was regretting. By the time the afternoon sunlight began turning golden, filtering through the dense oak leaves overhead, the treehouse was almost completely restored. The wooden floor was sturdier, the roof no longer leaked, and Isabella, sitting beneath the tree and looking up at the two of them standing inside the treehouse, smiled softly, wearing a rare expression of contentment that Damian hadn't seen on his mother's face in a very long time. "Looking at the two of you standing there, I feel as though I'm seeing Pat and me back then," she said quietly. Mia turned to Isabella and asked with genuine curiosity, What was it about my father that made you love playing with him so much?" Isabella laughed, a bright, ringing laugh that Damian rarely heard from his mother anymore. "I was a mischievous child, and my head was always full of ridiculous ideas, while your father was the opposite. He never said no. No matter how foolish my idea was, he'd always find a way to make it happen. Once, I insisted that we build a raft and let it float down the creek behind the house, simply because I'd read about one in a storybook. I didn't have any drawings or plans, just the idea itself. And yet your father spent 2 whole days fiddling with old pieces of wood, putting them together, and eventually we had a raft, even though it sank the very first time we put it in the water. We were both soaked from head to toe, sitting on the bank laughing until we could barely breathe, sometimes pushing each other into the creek, then climbing back out, only to do it again until the sun went down." She paused, her eyes distant as though she were living through that moment once more, then continued, her voice slower and more contemplative. "I think that, in the end, what people remember most isn't the perfect plans or the things they accomplished, but the people who were once willing to wade into the water with them, even when they knew beforehand that they were going to get wet." Damian and Mia both fell silent for a while, allowing those words to settle inside each of them in their own way. A shaft of sunlight slipped through the leaves and fell directly between the two of them, and in that moment, beneath the old oak that had witnessed so many seasons of sun and rain, 3 people, 3 generations connected by a friendship and a bond that had yet to be given a name, stood together in a rare moment of peace that none of them wanted to interrupt. 2.5 years after that day in the treehouse beneath the old oak, Isabella was still alive, something that even the doctors treating her had found astonishing, because according to the original prognosis, she'd been expected to have only about 1 to 2 years left, yet she'd surpassed that mark, living another 6 months under the devoted care of Damian and Mia, who were no longer merely the homeowner and the housekeeper, but had become a true family beneath that roof. During her final months, when Isabella's health had weakened considerably, she carried an unusual sense of peace that both Damian and Mia noticed, though neither could explain it, as if every wish she'd carried in her heart had finally been put in order, and she often sat beside the window looking out at the garden with a gentle smile, occasionally saying vague things such as, "Everything will be all right," without offering any further explanation, leaving the two of them to simply look at each other, sensing that something was quietly unfolding within her heart that she wasn't yet ready to reveal. Then, one autumn morning, as the soft sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, Isabella passed away peacefully at home, in the arms of both Damian and Mia, one of her hands holding her son's hand, while the other held Mia's, and until her final moment, her face still wore that same peaceful smile, as though she were being carried away in complete happiness rather than in the fear of parting. After the funeral, when all the relatives and friends had gone home, Damian sat alone in his completely darkened office, without turning on the lights, allowing only the faint moonlight through the window to fall across the familiar wooden desk, his heart feeling both empty and unbearably heavy at the same time. And in that silence, he heard soft footsteps behind him, followed by Mia's arms wrapping around his neck from behind, her chin resting gently on his shoulder as she whispered, "I want to go through all the pain and all the happiness still left in this life with you, no matter what happens." Damian took the hand she'd placed on his shoulder and gently squeezed it, unable to say a word because his throat had tightened with emotion, and after a long silence Mia spoke again, her voice trembling with feeling, telling him that 3 days before she died, Isabella had called her into her private room, given her a small knitted scarf made of wool, just the right size for a newborn baby, and said to her in a weak but determined voice, "I don't know if I'll have enough time to see it, but I believe. I've believed for a very long time, even before the two of you knew you believed it yourselves." Damian took the little scarf from Mia's hands, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched each carefully knitted stitch, surely completed by his mother in secret during the sleepless nights of the final days of her life. And he sat there in the darkness of his office, holding the tiny scarf against his heart, as though he were holding all the quiet love his mother had given to a future she knew she'd never have the chance to witness. She'd never once asked them even a single question about what they truly were to each other. She'd simply believed, with all the strength she had left, in a family she would never have the chance to meet, and she'd still finish that little scarf down to the very last stitch. Thank you everyone for patiently listening to the entire story of Damian, Mia, and Isabella, all the way to these final lines. If today's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with your loved ones, so that together we can listen to more touching stories that we bring to you every day. We'd truly love to know how you feel about this story, so please leave a comment below and share the thoughts that come from deep within your heart, because every comment you leave is a precious source of encouragement that inspires us to continue telling more meaningful stories in the days ahead. Finally, we sincerely wish you and your entire family abundant health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next videos.